Most of us grew up believing that being gentle is always a good thing. We were taught that kindness makes us lovable, politeness makes us respectable, and gentleness is a virtue that guarantees harmony. And on the surface, that sounds right. Who wouldn't want to be the kind, understanding, easier to get along with person in the room? But here's the part no one tells you. When gentleness becomes your default setting, when it shapes every word, every reaction, every decision, it quietly turns into a trap. It's the kind of trap that looks harmless from the outside because people smile at you, praise you, and even admire you for being so nice. Yet inside, you may start to feel invisible, unheard, and taken for granted. Think about it. How many times have you swallowed your feelings just to avoid conflict? How often have you said yes when your entire being wanted to scream no? How many moments have you chosen silence, not because you had nothing to say, but because you feared upsetting someone? That silence, that constant effort to stay soft, becomes the prison walls around your spirit. Gentleness without balance is not virtue, it's vulnerability dressed up as kindness. And society loves to reward this version of you because a gentle person is easier to control, easier to use, and easier to overlook. They don't cause trouble. They don't resist. They bend, and they keep bending until one day they break. The trap of gentleness is not obvious at first. It begins with small things, letting someone cut in line, agreeing to extra work you didn't want, forgiving an offense too quickly just to keep the peace. But little by little, those choices pile up, and what started as kindness transforms into a habit of self-erasure. You no longer protect your own needs, your own voice, or your own worth. Here's the irony. The gentler you try to be, the less respect you often receive. People might like you, yes, but liking isn't the same as valuing. They like you because you're convenient. They like you because you won't challenge them. They like you because you make their lives easier while quietly making your own life harder. And so, the hidden trap is this. Being gentle without strength doesn't lead to peace, it leads to powerlessness. You think you're building harmony, but you're actually giving away your authority. You think you're avoiding conflict, but you're only inviting deeper forms of exploitation. Now, this doesn't mean we should abandon gentleness. Kindness, compassion, empathy, these are precious qualities, but they need balance. Without boundaries, gentleness becomes weakness. Without courage, compassion becomes a mask for fear. Without truth, kindness becomes a lie we tell ourselves just to survive. This is the truth we need to face. The world doesn't reward you simply for being gentle. It rewards you for being whole, for being both soft and strong, both kind and firm, both compassionate and unshakable. Real gentleness is not about bending until you disappear. Real gentleness is about knowing when to bend and when to stand tall. And if you've ever felt drained from being too nice, if you've ever wondered why people don't treat you with the same care you offer them, maybe it's because you've been living inside this hidden trap. But once you see the trap, once you name it, you can begin to break free. The line between gentleness and weakness is razor thin, and most people never notice when they've crossed it. What begins as a desire to be kind slowly mutates into a pattern of surrender, a habit of giving in, a life where your voice carries no weight. And the cruel part, people don't even see it as kindness anymore. They see it as fragility. Picture this. You're in a meeting at work. An idea comes to mind, sharp and valuable, but instead of speaking up, you hesitate. Someone else jumps in, says something similar, and suddenly they are the one receiving credit. You tell yourself, it's fine, at least the idea is out there. But deep down, you know you gave away not just your words, but your recognition. That's not gentleness, that's weakness in disguise. Weakness wears a polite smile. It says, sure, no problem, when your neighbor asks for yet another favor you don't have the energy for. It says, I understand, when a partner repeatedly ignores your needs. It says, don't worry about me when you're drowning inside. Weakness always sounds agreeable, but its silence is screaming. The danger is subtle, because weakness doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in, small choice after small choice, until one day you wake up realizing your life doesn't feel like it belongs to you anymore. People have started to expect your compliance, your patience, your endless forgiveness, and the more you give, the less they respect you. There's a saying, people don't respect doormats, they wipe their feet on them. That's what happens when gentleness crosses into weakness. Instead of being admired for your compassion, you're overlooked. Instead of being valued for your kindness, you're used. And the sad truth, it's not even their fault entirely. It's because you've trained them to treat you that way. But weakness doesn't just affect how others see you. It affects how you see yourself. Every time you hold back your truth, every time you allow disrespect, every time you settle for less than you deserve, a small fracture appears in your self-esteem. Over time, those cracks deepen into a chasm. You don't just feel unheard, you start to believe you don't deserve to be heard. This is why weakness is dangerous. It doesn't just rob you of respect, it robs you of identity. It convinces you that disappearing is safer than showing up. That silence is better than honesty. That self-sacrifice is the only way to earn love. But love built on weakness isn't love. It's dependency, and it keeps you chained to people who value your compliance more than your soul. Real gentleness is not about being endlessly agreeable. It's about strength under control. It's about choosing compassion without losing your dignity. When you're strong, your gentleness shines like a gift. But when you're weak, your gentleness turns into a burden you carry alone. So, the question is not whether you should be gentle. The question is whether your gentleness comes from fear or from power. One diminishes you, the other elevates you. One keeps you silent, the other makes your silence meaningful. And the moment you understand the difference, everything about the way you move through the world begins to change. There's a heavy weight that comes with trying to be everyone's favorite person. At first, it feels harmless. After all, what's wrong with being agreeable, supportive, and accommodating? But the truth is, the constant urge to please others is one of the most exhausting prisons a person can live in. When your worth becomes tied to other people's approval, you stop asking yourself what you truly want. Instead, every decision is filtered through one question. Will this make them happy? You smile when you're tired, you agree when you're overwhelmed. You stay silent when you're hurt, all in the name of keeping the peace. But what peace is there, really, if it comes at the cost of your own spirit? People-pleasing feels noble on the outside, but inside it corrodes. You carry the burden of everyone else's expectations while your own needs rot at the bottom of the pile. You tell yourself you're being selfless, but deep down, it's not selflessness, it's fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict. Fear that if you stop pleasing, you'll stop being loved. And here's the cruel paradox. The harder you try to make everyone else happy, the less happy you become. Because no matter how much you give, there will always be someone who wants more. No matter how many times you bend, someone will ask you to bend further. Pleasing is a game you can never win, because the rules keep changing and the scoreboard never favors you. Think about the moments when you've said yes, even though every fiber of your being wanted to say no. In that instant, a small part of you disappears, And the more it happens, the less you recognize the person in the mirror. Instead of living your own life, you're living a patchwork of other people's desires, stitched together by your silence. And people-pleasing doesn't just drain you, it quietly poisons your relationships. The more you sacrifice yourself for others, the more resentment brews beneath the surface. You give and give and give, hoping someone will finally notice your efforts, but instead they grow accustomed to the giving. They assume it's endless. And when you finally reach your breaking point, the explosion feels sudden and unfair to them because they never saw the struggle you kept hidden. Here's the hard truth. People don't love you more for pleasing them. They love you more when you're authentic, when you're honest about your limits, when your yes actually means yes, and your no carries the weight of integrity. Because authenticity creates respect, and respect creates lasting connection. So why do we keep carrying this burden? Because somewhere along the way, we confused being loved with being needed. But being needed is not the same as being valued. And if the only reason people keep you around is because you make their lives easier, then what you've built isn't love. It's dependency dressed up as affection. The burden of always pleasing others will crush you if you let it. But the moment you put it down, the moment you allow yourself to disappoint someone in order to stay true to yourself, you'll feel something you may not have felt in years. Freedom. Freedom to live by your own truth, to honor your own needs, to finally breathe without carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Because in the end, life isn't about making everyone else comfortable. It's about finding the courage to live in alignment with who you really are. There comes a moment when kindness crosses a hidden line. At first, you think you're simply being generous, flexible, or understanding. But slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to let go of your boundaries. And when your boundaries vanish, so does your sense of self. Boundaries are not walls. They're not acts of selfishness. They are the invisible lines that protect your energy, your dignity, and your values. They are the gentle reminders to yourself and to others. This is who I am, and this is how far I can go. But when those lines fade, your life no longer feels like yours. You say yes when you want to say no. You stay quiet when your voice aches to be heard. You allow people to cross into your space because you fear what will happen if you stand firm. Over time, this surrender doesn't look like love. It looks like self-erasure. And one day you wake up wondering, who am I? When did I disappear? In Buddhism, there's a teaching about the middle way, the balance between indulgence and denial, between weakness and aggression. Boundaries lie right there in the middle. Without them, you swing from one extreme to another, either endlessly soft and yielding or suddenly explosive when the pressure becomes unbearable. When you lose boundaries, you don't just lose yourself, you also confuse others. People cannot respect limits they don't see. They take as much as you give, not out of cruelty, but because you've silently taught them that your needs don't matter. And so, the cycle continues. You give, they take, you grow resentful, and still you remain silent. But here's the truth. Boundaries are acts of compassion. Not only for yourself, but for everyone around you. By setting them, you teach others how to love you in a healthy way. You give them clarity instead of confusion. You create relationships that thrive on respect rather than assumption. Think of the parable of the raft. The raft is useful when it carries you across the river, but once you reach the other side, clinging to it only weighs you down. In the same way, endless gentleness without boundaries may help in certain moments, but if you cling to it in every situation, it becomes a burden. Wisdom is knowing when to let go, when to say enough, when to draw the line. Losing yourself is not an overnight tragedy. It happens drop by drop, one small compromise here, another silent surrender there, until finally you're living a life shaped entirely by others. But the beauty of the Buddha's teaching is that awareness itself is liberation. The moment you realize you've lost your boundaries, you can begin to rebuild them. And when you do, something shifts. The fear of rejection fades, replaced by the calm strength of authenticity. You no longer need to be endlessly gentle or endlessly yielding. You can be both kind and firm, compassionate and clear, soft-hearted and strong. Because true compassion doesn't erase you, it includes you. There's a subtle trap many of us fall into, a belief that if people like us, we are safe, worthy, and whole. It feels reassuring to think that approval is the currency of happiness. But here's the danger. Being liked is not the same as being loved, and it is certainly not the same as being respected. The illusion begins early. As children, we discover that certain behaviors win us praise, being quiet, being agreeable, being good. And so, we learn to mold ourselves into what others want to see. That mold becomes tighter with age, until one day we don't know whether our smile belongs to us or to the audience we're performing for. But the truth is, being liked is fragile. It can vanish the moment you disagree, the moment you show a side of yourself that doesn't match someone else's expectations. Approval is conditional. It shifts like the wind. And when your self-worth is tied to that shifting approval, your life becomes a storm of insecurity. Think about it. How many times have you held back your true opinion not because you doubted yourself, but because you feared losing someone's affection? How many times have you dressed a certain way, spoken a certain way, or laughed at jokes that weren't funny, all to maintain that precious image of being likable? In those moments, you weren't being liked. You were being tolerated for the mask you wore. In Buddhism, there is a deep teaching about impermanence. Everything changes. Relationships, feelings, opinions, they all rise and fall. If you chase the illusion of being liked, you're chasing something that cannot last. It's like trying to hold onto water with your bare hands. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips away. What truly matters is authenticity. Because when you live authentically, you may not be liked by everyone, but the people who remain for the right reasons. They are drawn not to the version of you that pleases, but to the truth of who you are. And that truth is unshakable because it doesn't depend on shifting opinions. It comes from within. There's a Zen story of a monk who was falsely accused of fathering a child. When the villagers confronted him, demanding he take responsibility, all he said was, "Is that so?" He raised the child without complaint, enduring their judgment. Later, when the truth was revealed and the villagers begged for forgiveness, he again replied, "Is that so?" His peace didn't depend on being liked or disliked. It came from living in alignment with his own heart. Chasing the illusion of being liked is like running in circles. You never arrive. But when you step out of that circle, when you dare to be disliked for the sake of your truth, something astonishing happens. You find freedom. Because real peace doesn't come from being liked by everyone. It comes from liking yourself enough to live honestly. There comes a moment when you realize that chasing approval, living to be liked, and softening yourself until you disappear has left you drained. And in that quiet recognition, a question begins to rise. If being too harsh pushes people away, but being too gentle makes me vanish, then where is the right place to stand? The Buddha offered an answer centuries ago, and it remains as timeless as the breath moving through your chest. He called it the middle way. Not the path of extremes, not a life of rigid harshness or fragile gentleness, but the steady road between them. Think of a string on a musical instrument. If you pull it too tight, it snaps. If you leave it too loose, it makes no sound. But when you find the perfect balance, the string produces music, pure, steady, resonant. That is your life when you learn balance. True strength is not found in domination, nor in submission. It rests in your ability to stand firmly without crushing, to speak clearly without shouting, to act with kindness without being used. Strength in balance means you are gentle but not naive, strong but not cruel. This balance gives you something far more powerful than either extreme: presence. People can feel it. They sense that you cannot be manipulated, but neither are you closed off. You radiate calm certainty. Your yes carries weight and your no commands respect. And here's the hidden gift: when you walk the middle way, you don't just protect yourself, you liberate yourself. You're no longer chained by the fear of being disliked, nor trapped in the illusion of control. You live in the steady space between, where peace and power can exist together. But there's still one more challenge. Even when you discover this balance, the world will test it. People will push, situations will pull, and your inner storms will try to drag you back into old patterns. And that's where the next step unfolds: the courage to face resistance without losing yourself. Balance gives you strength, but strength must eventually find its voice. And that voice is the truth. For many people, speaking the truth feels like walking barefoot across fire. You fear rejection, you fear hurting others, you fear the silence that might follow. So instead, you swallow your words, smile politely, and nod in agreement, even when every part of you is screaming inside. But here's the paradox. Every time you silence your truth to protect others, you wound yourself. And over time, those small wounds bleed into resentment, bitterness, and regret. The courage to speak the truth is not about being blunt or cruel. It's about standing firmly in honesty while holding compassion in your heart. Truth without compassion can cut. Compassion without truth can suffocate, but together they can heal. When you say what needs to be said, with clarity, with respect, with steadiness, you send a message to the world: I value myself, and I value you enough to be real. That authenticity doesn't always guarantee comfort, but it always creates freedom. Think of a storm clearing the air. At first, it's wild, unsettling, even frightening. But when the winds pass, the sky is brighter, the air is cleaner, and life feels renewed. Speaking the truth works the same way. It may shake things, it may disrupt false harmony, but it opens the way for something more genuine to grow. And here's the secret: when you speak the truth with courage, you don't just free yourself. You give others permission to do the same. Your honesty becomes a mirror reflecting back the possibility of living without masks. Yet courage is not built in a single moment. It is practiced, word by word, choice by choice. Sometimes your voice will tremble, sometimes your heart will race. But each time you choose truth over silence, you step closer to becoming whole. Still, there is another challenge waiting. Because even as you learn to speak honestly, there is the temptation to swing too far, to confuse rawness with wisdom, to mistake bluntness for bravery. And that brings us to the next part of the journey: learning how to protect your inner peace while navigating the storms of conflict. Truth without boundaries can scatter like wind, powerful for a moment but easily lost. To live with courage, you must also build the walls that protect your inner garden. These walls are not prisons, they are boundaries. And boundaries, far from pushing people away, are what invite true respect. Think about the people you admire most. Are they the ones who always say yes, who bend until they break? Or are they the ones who know where they stand, who give generously yet never allow themselves to be drained dry? Respect does not grow from endless availability, it grows from clarity. A boundary is a quiet declaration. This is who I am. This is what I allow. This is where I stop. It is not aggression. It is not rejection. It is self-honor. And when you honor yourself, you teach others how to honor you too. Boundaries create safety. They define the space where your truth can breathe and where relationships can thrive without resentment. Without them, even kindness becomes poison because it is given out of obligation rather than love. But with them, your kindness becomes pure because it flows from freedom, not fear. Many fear setting boundaries because they imagine they will lose love. But the truth is reversed. Without boundaries, you lose yourself. With them, you gain relationships rooted in authenticity. Yes, some may walk away when you draw the line, but those who remain are the ones who see your worth, not just your usefulness. And there is a deeper wisdom here. Boundaries are not only about saying no, they are about creating the space for a powerful yes. When you stop scattering your energy across everything, you can give fully to the people and purposes that matter most. It is in this space, where truth meets boundaries, that real respect is born. Not forced respect, not fearful respect, but the kind that grows naturally, the kind that endures. And yet, even with respect, life does not promise smooth waters. There will be storms, losses, and endings that no amount of boundaries can prevent. Which leads us into the next part of this journey, learning how to transform pain into wisdom and suffering into strength. When boundaries are set, when truth finds its voice, something remarkable begins to take shape. Gentleness, once mistaken for weakness, fuses with strength, and together they form power. Not the kind of power that dominates or controls, but the kind that transforms everything it touches. Gentleness by itself can be fragile, easily crushed by the weight of the world. Strength by itself can be rigid, breaking under its own hardness. But when gentleness and strength join hands, they create a force that is unshakable yet compassionate, firm yet kind, immovable yet alive. This is the paradox the wise have always known. True power is not loud, it doesn't need to prove itself. True power is quiet, steady, undeniable. It is the calm presence in the middle of chaos, the voice that speaks softly yet carries more weight than 1,000 shouts. Think of water. It yields, it bends, it flows around obstacles without resistance. And yet over time, water shapes valleys, wears down mountains, and carves canyons deeper than stone. That is gentleness with strength. Patient, enduring, unstoppable. When you live this way, you don't need to demand respect, it comes naturally. You don't need to force influence, it radiates from you. People listen not because you insist, but because they feel the gravity of your presence. And most importantly, you yourself feel whole. No longer torn between being liked and being respected, no longer trapped between weakness and aggression. Instead, you stand in the quiet center of power where peace and strength merge into one. This is where the journey has been leading, not to abandon gentleness, but to elevate it. To let it be tempered by strength so that it becomes unbreakable. To let it shine, not as fragility, but as power. And as we arrive at this realization, there is one final truth waiting to be uncovered. The ultimate lesson hidden beneath the surface of this entire path. A conclusion that ties everything together and reveals why this balance matters not just for survival, but for living fully. So we come full circle. What began as a hidden trap, the quiet danger of mistaking gentleness for goodness, has transformed into something deeper, something far more profound. Gentleness was never the problem. The real danger was the illusion that gentleness must mean surrender, that kindness must mean weakness, that softness must mean silence. But now we see clearly, true gentleness is not the absence of strength. It is strength under control. It is power expressed through compassion. It is the ability to hold steady in the storm, to speak truth without cruelty, to stand firm without aggression. Gentleness, redefined, is no longer about being liked or avoiding conflict. It is about embodying balance, soft enough to bend, strong enough to endure, wise enough to know when to yield and when to stand tall. It is the dance between water and stone, the harmony between silence and voice, the middle way the Buddha spoke of centuries ago. And here's the beauty. When you live with this kind of gentleness, you free yourself. You are no longer trapped in the exhausting cycle of pleasing others, no longer losing yourself in the name of false peace. Instead, you radiate a presence that commands respect, nurtures connection, and inspires trust. This is gentleness not as weakness but as power, not as submission but as choice, not as fear but as love. And love, when expressed through strength, becomes the most transformative force in the world. So the next time you feel the urge to silence yourself for the sake of harmony, pause. The next time you're tempted to bend until you break, breathe. And remember, gentleness is not about disappearing. It's about standing in your truth, carrying strength in one hand and compassion in the other. This is how you redefine gentleness. This is how you step into power. And this is how life begins to flow, naturally, beautifully, and fully alive. If these words touch something within you, take a moment to carry this wisdom into your own life. And if you feel called to walk deeper on this path with us, we invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, you'll find reflections, stories, and teachings to nurture your spirit, calm your mind, and guide you gently toward balance. May you continue to grow in strength, in gentleness, and in peace.